The village had no name anymore, just coordinates on Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov's worn map, 52.4° north, Tuanaketagor east. What remained of it huddled in the February snow like broken teeth, collapsed roofs, scorched walls, a church steeple leaning at an angle that defied physics. Volkov's platoon had been marching for 6 days through the Belarusian winter, pursuing German forces that retreated faster than exhausted Soviet soldiers could advance. 23 men had started this patrol. 19 remained. The cold had taken 2, dysentery another, and a sniper had claimed the 4th during a foolish moment when Private Grekov had stood too long in an open doorway. Now they moved through the village ruins like ghosts, searching for anything useful, ammunition, food, shelter, anything that might help them survive another week of this war that had already consumed 3 years of their lives. Sergeant Alexei Petrov, a former schoolteacher from Leningrad who now commanded the 2nd Squad, emerged from what had been a general store. "Lieutenant, there's a cellar intact, might have supplies." They descended carefully, rifles ready, expecting nothing but finding more than they'd hoped. Canned goods with German labels, a case of frozen potatoes, medical supplies, and in the corner, covered by a Wehrmacht blanket, an olive green box with unfamiliar markings and a hand crank on its side. Corporal Ivan Sokolov, their designated radio operator, knelt beside it with the reverence usually reserved for religious icons. His hands, wrapped in rags because his winter gloves had worn through weeks ago, carefully removed the blanket. "American," he breathed. "It's an American field radio. SCR 300, I think. Battery-powered frequency modulation." He looked up at Volkov with an expression caught between hope and disbelief. "Sir, if this works, we could contact headquarters. Real contact, not just the broken field telephone we've been using." Volkov nodded, though he wasn't sure why an American radio would be in a German-occupied Belarusian village. Lend-lease equipment went to units far more important than his, but war created strange redistributions. Perhaps the Germans had captured it, abandoned it, left it behind in their hasty retreat. "Can you make it work?" "I can try, Lieutenant." They established their temporary position in the least damaged building, a stone house with half its roof intact and a fireplace that still drew smoke properly. While half the platoon stood watch and the others prepared what passed for a meal, thin soup made from the potatoes, and a single can of German meat rations divided among 19 men, Sokolov worked on the radio. He was 24 years old but looked 40, his face hollowed by hunger and frostbite scars marking both cheeks. Before the war, he'd been studying electrical engineering at Moscow University. Now he applied that education to keeping their equipment functioning with wire scavenged from destroyed vehicles and solder melted from anything metal he could find. The American radio was remarkably intact. Sokolov cleaned the connections, checked the vacuum tubes, tested the hand crank that charged the batteries. "It's well made," he said to no one in particular. "Better than ours?" "The components are sealed against moisture. The wiring is color-coded and look," he pointed at small labels inside the casing, maintenance instructions printed right on the chassis. They designed their equipment expecting soldiers to repair it themselves. Lieutenant Volkov crouched beside him, grateful for the fireplace warmth after another day in the killing cold. "Will it transmit?" "I think so. But let me try receiving first. Save the battery power." Sokolov attached the antenna wire, running it up through the damaged roof and securing it to a remaining beam. He adjusted the frequency dial, watching the needle move across the scale. Static filled the room, a harsh crackling that made several soldiers look up from their soup. Then through the noise something else, a voice speaking English. The room went silent. Every man stopped moving, stopped eating, stopped breathing. The voice was clear, professional, speaking in crisp military cadence. "Baker 3 to Baker Command. Position secure, no enemy contact. Continuing patrol route Delta as ordered." More static. Then another voice, different frequency, speaking Russian but with an unfamiliar accent. "Supply convoy delayed. Weather conditions severe. Estimated arrival 2200 hours." Sokolov's fingers moved across the dial, hunting through frequencies like a musician, searching for the right key. And then, impossibly, wonderfully, music. The music came through the speaker like a voice from a dream, a trumpet, playing notes that seemed to dance rather than march. Then a piano joined, and drums and a saxophone that soared and dipped through melodies none of them had ever heard before. Jazz. American jazz, though most of Volkov's men wouldn't have known to call it that. In the Soviet Union, such music was officially discouraged as decadent Western corruption, though some had heard recordings before the war passed secretly between music lovers in Moscow and Leningrad. Here, in a half-destroyed house in a nameless village, it sounded like a transmission from another planet. Private Boris Kuznetsov, 19 years old and from a farming village so small it had never received electricity, stood slowly, his soup forgotten. His eyes were wide. "What? What is that?" "American radio broadcast," Sokolov said quietly, not adjusting the dial, letting the music continue. "Armed Forces Network, probably. They broadcast to their troops." Sergeant Petrov moved closer, his schoolteacher's curiosity overcoming his soldier's wariness. "It's jazz. American jazz music, created by their Negro musicians, though white Americans play it too now. It's about improvisation, about individual expression within collective harmony." He stopped, suddenly aware that such artistic analysis might sound subversive. But no one was listening to his words. They were listening to the music. The trumpet reached a high note and held it, pure and clear, and something in that sound cut through the exhaustion, the hunger, the accumulated trauma of 3 years at war. Some men had tears on their faces. Others sat motionless, hardly breathing, as if afraid any movement might break the spell and return them to the reality of frozen villages and distant artillery fire. Volkov found himself remembering his wife, Anna, dancing in their apartment in Kiev before the war, before the Germans came, before everything burned. They'd had a phonograph, a luxury his father's position as a factory manager had afforded. Anna had loved to dance, spinning in the small space between their furniture, laughing, alive. He hadn't thought about her dancing in months. The music ended. A voice spoke in English, cheerful and energetic in a way that seemed obscene given the war. That night, as half the platoon slept and the other half stood watch against the darkness and the cold and the possibility of German patrols, Sergeant Petrov sat near the dying fire and wrote in his journal. He'd kept it since the war began, a small notebook with a leather cover that his wife had given him when he left Leningrad. Most entries were brief, locations, dates, casualties, records of survival. But tonight he wrote differently. February 18th, 1943, village with no name. "We found an American radio today. Sokolov made it work, and we heard their broadcasts. Most importantly, we heard their music. Jazz, that American art form that our commissars tell us is decadent and meaningless. But here in this destroyed place it was neither. It was proof that somewhere people still create beauty instead of destruction. Somewhere musicians still play for audiences who came to listen, not to die." The sound of that trumpet felt like a message. The world you remember still exists. People still dance. People still laugh. This war has not consumed everything. He paused, considering whether such thoughts were dangerous, whether this journal might someday be read by the wrong eyes, whether expressing longing for Western culture could be interpreted as political deviation. Then he continued writing anyway. Young Kuznetsov stood when the music played, and I saw on his face something I haven't seen in months: wonder. Not fear, not exhaustion, not the grim determination that keeps us moving forward. Pure wonder, like a child seeing snow for the first time. That expression alone justified finding this radio. We spend so much time trying to remember why we fight. For the motherland, for Stalin, for communism, for our families. But tonight I think we fought for something simpler, for the right to hear music again, for the possibility that someday we might dance. Lieutenant Volkov appeared beside him, materializing from the shadows. "Writing again, Alexei." "Yes, sir." "Be careful what you write. Political officers read journals sometimes." "I know, sir." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Volkov said quietly, "But you're right. About the music. It reminded me of before." Petrov understood. Before was a country they all carried inside themselves, a place that might not exist anymore except in memory. The platoon stayed in the village for 3 days, longer than tactically wise, but justified because they were all near collapse from exhaustion and hunger. The cold had killed more Soviet soldiers than German bullets this winter, and Volkov knew his men needed rest if they were to continue functioning. Each night, after posting guards and distributing rations, Sokolov powered up the American radio. It became a ritual, something sacred in its regularity. The men would gather in the stone house, sitting on salvaged furniture or on the floor, and listen to whatever frequencies Sokolov could find. They heard military communications, American, British, even Soviet units with better equipment than Volkov's platoon possessed. They heard weather reports, supply coordination, casualty evacuations, the bureaucratic language of war, efficient and impersonal. But they also heard the music broadcasts. The Armed Forces Network played for 30 minutes each evening, a program designed to maintain morale among American troops deployed across the world. Jazz, swing, big band arrangements that made the stone house feel less like a military position and more like some impossible nightclub transplanted into the Belarusian winter. Private Kuznetsov began moving to the music, tentative at first, just swaying slightly. Then, emboldened by the darkness and the fact that his comrades were too absorbed to mock him, he started dancing awkward, untrained steps that bore no relationship to any formal dance technique, but full of joy nonetheless. Corporal Yuri Medvedev, a former factory worker from the Urals, watched the young private dance and suddenly laughed. A sound so unexpected that several men reached for their rifles before realizing it was laughter, not danger. "He looks like a scarecrow in a windstorm," Medvedev said, but without cruelty. Then incredibly he stood and joined the dancing, his movements equally graceless but genuine. Within minutes, 5 men were dancing in the firelight, while the American radio played music that had traveled thousands of miles to reach this destroyed village. Lieutenant Volkov watched from the doorway, not participating but not stopping them either. He was thinking about a regulation he'd memorized during officer training. Soldiers of the Red Army maintain discipline and revolutionary consciousness at all times. Vaxi Captain Mikhail Glebov arrived on the 4th day, accompanied by 2 soldiers and an air of authority that preceded him like winter wind. He was a Zampolit, a political officer, responsible for ensuring ideological correctness and reporting any deviation from party doctrine. Volkov had been expecting someone like him eventually. Their platoon had been isolated too long, moving through liberated territories without supervision, without oversight. The army tolerated independence only to a point. Glebov was 42, older than most combat officers, with a face that showed no evidence of frostbite or hunger. He'd spent the war in administrative positions, ensuring loyalty rather than fighting Germans. His uniform was clean, his boots unbroken, and he carried a pistol that looked freshly oiled. "Lieutenant Volkov," he said without preamble, "I'm here to conduct a political review of your unit. There have been concerns about discipline and ideological reliability." Volkov's stomach tightened, but his face remained neutral. "My men have been in continuous combat for 4 months, Captain. They've followed every order, taken every objective assigned." Yes, Glebov dismissed this with a wave. "Military performance is adequate. But military performance is not sufficient. Soldiers of the Red Army must maintain proper revolutionary consciousness." He looked around the village, his expression showing distaste for the destruction, as if the rubble was a personal affront. "I'll need to interview your men individually. Also, I understand you've been operating a radio. I'll need to review all transmissions." "We haven't transmitted anything, Captain, only received. We found an American radio and Corporal Sokolov, an American radio." Glebov's attention sharpened. "You're listening to enemy propaganda. American forces are our allies, Captain. The broadcasts are military coordination and I'll determine what they are." Glebov gestured to his escorts. "Show me this radio." They descended into the cellar where Sokolov kept the equipment. The corporal stood quickly, offering a salute that Glebov barely acknowledged. The political officer examined the radio with obvious suspicion, as if the machine itself might be ideologically contaminated. "What have you been listening to?" "Military communications, sir. Weather reports. Coordination between Allied forces." Glebov turned the frequency dial, and by chance, or perhaps by something deeper than chance, landed on an Armed Forces Network broadcast. Jazz filled the cellar. The political officer's face darkened. "This is what you've been listening to." Glebov's voice was cold. "Decadent Western music? Bourgeois corruption broadcast while Soviet soldiers die defending the motherland?" Sergeant Petrov, who'd been standing guard outside, heard the accusation and entered the cellar. His schoolteacher's instinct to defend education, to defend culture, to defend the idea that beauty mattered even in war, especially in war, overrode his survival instinct. Captain, with respect, that music is not corruption, it's art. American jazz is a legitimate artistic form, created by oppressed people expressing their, "You're defending Western culture." Glebov turned on him. "What's your name, Sergeant?" "Petrov, sir." "Alexei Petrov. I was a teacher before the war. Literature and music. I taught it a teacher. Of course. The political officer's contempt was absolute. Tell me, Sergeant Petrov, when you taught, did you also tell your students that Soviet music was inferior to this? This noise? I never said that, Captain. Soviet composers are... Did you play this music for your men? Did you allow them to be exposed to Western propaganda while they should have been studying the works of Stalin, the history of the party, the principles of Marxist-Leninism? Volkov stepped forward, trying to redirect Glebov's attention away from Petrov. "Captain, we found the radio 4 days ago. My men have been in combat for months. They needed rest, they needed something to maintain morale, and the music..." Morale. Glebov's laugh was harsh. Soviet soldiers draw morale from revolutionary consciousness, from their love of the motherland, from their faith in the party and in Comrade Stalin. Not from bourgeois American jazz. He gestured to his escorts. "Destroy the radio. And I want this sergeant placed under arrest, pending investigation for..." Private Kuznetsov stepped down into the cellar, followed by Medvedev and 3 other soldiers. They weren't threatening, weren't holding weapons, but their presence was unmistakable. Young Kuznetsov, who danced to the music with such innocent joy, spoke with a firmness that surprised even Volkov. "Captain, respectfully, we've been fighting Germans for 3 years. We've seen things no one should see. We've lost friends, lost hope, lost almost everything. That music reminded us what we're fighting for. Not abstractions, sir. Real things, beauty, joy, the right to dance." The cellar went silent. What Kuznetsov had done was close to mutiny. Soldiers didn't contradict political officers, didn't defend Western culture, didn't speak of abstractions like beauty, when party doctrine demanded concrete revolutionary consciousness. But the young private stood his ground, and behind him his comrades stood too. Glebov looked at the assembled soldiers, calculating. He was one political officer with 2 escorts, facing 19 combat veterans who'd spent months in conditions that made men hard and desperate. He could order arrests, could threaten court-martial, could invoke Stalin's name and party authority. But he was also pragmatic enough to recognize when authority met its limits. "Lieutenant Volkov," he said finally, his voice controlled but tight, "I'm formally recommending your unit for remedial political education once you return to division headquarters. This incident suggests serious ideological weakness." He turned to leave, then paused. "The radio will remain, but its use will be restricted to military communications only. No more music broadcasts. No more exposure to Western cultural propaganda. Is that understood?" "Yes, Captain," Volkov said, relief and resignation mixing in equal measure. After Glebov departed with his escorts, the men dispersed slowly, the confrontation having drained something from them. Petrov sat on the cellar stairs, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear but from the crash of adrenaline. "I shouldn't have spoken," he said quietly. "I should have stayed silent." "No," Volkov replied. "You said what we all thought, what Kuznetsov said, that the music mattered. That night, against Glebov's orders, Sokolov powered up the American radio one final time. The men gathered silently, and when the jazz began playing, a slow, melancholy piece that sounded like goodbye, they listened with the intensity of people memorizing something precious before it's taken away. Private Kuznetsov didn't dance. None of them did. They simply sat in the firelight, listening to music that came from a world where people still created beauty, and tried to carry that sound inside themselves, a secret frequency that no political officer could silence. Spring came late to Belarus in 1943, but it came. The platoon moved out of the village in March, rejoining their division for the grinding advance westward. The American radio remained, but true to his word, Volkov restricted its use to military communications. The music broadcasts became a memory, something men spoke about in whispers during long marches, a shared secret that bound them together. Sergeant Petrov never faced formal charges. Glebov's report was filed but lost in the bureaucratic chaos of a war that consumed millions of lives and thousands of reports daily. The incident faded into the background noise of survival. But Petrov continued his journal, now writing in a code of his own invention, hiding his thoughts inside descriptions of weather and terrain. In May, he wrote, "We liberated a town today. The Germans left it mostly intact. There was a piano in the town hall, damaged but functional." Kuznetsov sat down and played, badly, without training, just pressing keys and listening to the sounds. It wasn't jazz. It wasn't anything recognizable. But it was music, created by one of us, and that mattered. I think that's what the American radio taught us. That music, beauty, art, culture, isn't a luxury or a distraction or bourgeois corruption. It's proof of humanity. We fight so that someday, somewhere, people can dance again. So that young men like Kuznetsov can press piano keys and make sound instead of war. The platoon continued westward through 1943, through 1944, through the terrible final year of 1945. Of the 19 men who'd listened to jazz in that destroyed village, 11 survived the war. Lieutenant Volkov returned to Kiev to find his apartment destroyed, but his wife alive. Having survived the occupation by teaching piano to German officers' children, a compromise that haunted her, but had kept her breathing. Sergeant Petrov went back to Leningrad, to a city that had been besieged and starved but not broken, and returned to teaching. His first class after the war, he told them about music, all kinds of music, including jazz, and about why beauty mattered, especially in dark times. Private Kuznetsov, who'd danced in the firelight, never learned to play piano properly, but he kept trying, pressing keys in empty halls and listening to the sounds echo, remembering a trumpet that had reached across continents to tell him something important, that the world contained more than war, that people still created instead of destroyed, that somewhere always someone was dancing. And Corporal Sokolov, the radio operator, kept the American radio throughout the war, carrying it through Poland and Germany, and finally to Berlin. When the fighting ended, he didn't destroy it or turn it into authorities. He kept it hidden in his quarters, and on quiet nights, he'd power it up and search through frequencies, hunting for that sound, that jazz, that proof that somewhere in the world, people were playing music instead of fighting wars. He never told anyone about this. It was his secret frequency, his private channel to hope, his reminder that even in the coldest winter, even in the darkest cellar, beauty could find a way through the static.